For the true figure painters out there, look away now, because this could get ugly. Armour Modellers love making excuses for how bad their figure painting is, or at very worst, don't even try for fear of failure, and I get it. There are so many excellent figure painters out and about, it can be a little intimidating at times. Including figures to your Armour models, or any model for that matter, instantly adds character and brings life to the subject, as well as giving the viewer an instant sense of scale as to what they're looking at. I love figure painting, but I just don't do it enough to get my skill set to the next level. But I do it enough to be able to present a figure that will enhance the models that I'm building, and the model is really my primary focus. The maze of information around the uniforms the Hetzer crews wore is a bit of a minefield, and from what I understand, it was pretty much a case of anything goes. As a general idea, from 1942, the Panzerjager crews would wear the field grey uniform, but from May of 1944, the uniform depended on the unit they served with. And units under the command of Panzer or Panzer Grenadier divisions wore the black traditional Panzer uniform, and that was good enough for me to try a different painting technique and see if I could enhance the colours of this black uniform in an interesting way. Bear in mind, I am no expert in this field, and if this genre has taught me anything, it is to never deal in absolutes, because you'll get caught out every time. If you have better information on the uniforms that a certain crew wore in a certain vehicle, then I would encourage you to follow your own path and use this as a bit of a guide on how I've painted the figures for the Hetzer that's coming up.
Okay, let's get started.
The figures I'm going to use, or at least planning to, is a set from New World Miniatures. I'm not overly familiar with the brand, and I picked them up for a very good price at a local swap and sell. It's important to note that a well sculpted figure can make a huge difference to the painting and final result. A beautifully sculpted figure is always worth the money if you can afford it. These guys were okay without being remarkable, but should present better than any of the other options I had. They've been primed using Mr. Surfacer black and mounted on a small piece of wire. And just to cover off on that, touching the figure while painting it is never a good idea, and it's always good practice to drill a small hole in the feet of the figure and super glue a small stem of wire in the base. This allows me to stick the wire into something like a cork and minimise the chance of touching and contaminating the surface of the figure. The German tanker uniforms can often be a little challenging to execute in scale. Black is never truly black, and as painters we are constantly trying to trick the eye by creating highlights and shadows and creating depth in colours. I thought I'd try something different with these figures and wanted to see how far I could go with just using the airbrush and creating the highlights using that. With the black base in place, I first applied a layer of dark grey. I'm not looking to cover the whole figure, but looking to cover about 80% of it, and looking to do that in a structured way. I'm focusing on the raised sections of the jacket and pants and avoiding the deepest recesses. The paint is thinned using IPA or isopropyl alcohol, and it's thinned to around 60-65% IPA and 35% paint. And by thinning the paint so much, I'm able to keep the layers quite translucent and help create a smooth transition between the colours. I'll flip-flop between the figures, but essentially I'm using the same technique on both figures, or at least for the uniform. With the dark grey in place on the figure, I added a touch of sky grey to the dark grey that was still in the cup of the airbrush and set about laying the second highlight colour. Again, I'm focusing on the raised areas, only this time I'm looking to go at about a 50% coverage. I don't want to hide the previous layer, I'm looking to bring it to a peak. With the lightened mix still in the cup, a touch of white is then added to the process and it's repeated, but you guessed it, working in an even smaller surface area, creating the greatest highlights over the figure. I haven't made excuses for my figure painting, but I will make excuses for my wet palette. It's disgusting, but it's functional. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with a wet palette, it is a tool that allows you to extend the working life and usability of acrylic paints and keeps them wet, which obviously keeps them from drying out whilst you're trying to use them. Mine is from AK Interactive, although it would be easy enough to make one of your own from a takeaway container and a few household items. It consists of the tub, the water-soaked sponge and a layer of felt, and finally a piece of baking paper is sat on top. Ideally you want a good connection with minimal air between the felt and the paper, and this will help keep the system wet and working. I'd gone as far as I could with the airbrush, and it was now time for the part that scares most modelers off, and that's painting the faces. I actually enjoy the face painting because if you're able to get that part right, the rest of the figure tends to just come together. The secret to a successful figure is the face. One of the techniques I've had the most luck with my figure painting is using acrylic paints from Citadel. The paint is very dense, but it brush paints beautifully. My flesh layer starts with a colour called Bugman's Glow, and it's highly unlikely you'll get a decent coverage from one coat. Never try and shortcut that, and be patient. This initial layer was painted using 3 coats of water-thin paint and built up slowly. Each layer must be dry before you start the next one. Now, the big question, should you paint the eyes of your figure or not? And the answer is simple, it depends. If you look closely at the 2 figures I'm using, you will notice that the fellow standing up has clearly defined eyes, whereas the fellow kneeling is clearly squinting. If I was going to try and paint eyes on him, I'd essentially be painting his eyelids rather than his eyeballs. So for that reason, I'll be approaching each of these figures slightly differently. Painting eyes is always a leap of faith and can go wrong real fast. But it's a matter of having a little faith in the process and trusting it will all come together. Pale sand is used for the whites of the eyes, and I'm not too worried about the shape at this stage, that will be refined later. A touch of dark brown is then used to paint in the pupil. However, that is done as a line through the center of the eye rather than a dot. After a short time, I'm able to go back with the Bugman's Glow and refine the shape of the eye. This paint has a high pigment content and manages to correct the shape pretty easily. A good brush and keeping the paint wet is your friend here, and of course a steady hand and some practice doesn't go astray. The next stage in the journey is Cadian Flesh. This will blend and pair beautifully with the Bugman's Glow and start to build up my flesh tones. A small amount of the paint is placed in the wet palette, and using a fine brush I start to work around the face and the hands. By keeping the paint reasonably wet, it will be semi-transparent and allow me to build up and blend the colours. My first layer of Cadian Flesh covers most of the surface area. I then move around the areas with the second and third layer of the paint, with each layer covering a smaller surface area each time. This allows the highlights to be slowly built up and blend with each other. Try and keep your brush strokes moving in the same direction for each layer to create an even coverage of the paint. I felt the eyes were looking a little toy-like, so a tiny speck of white was added to the centre of the pupil. It's hard to detect on camera, but it is there nonetheless. Time for the next round of highlights, and to lighten the Cadian flesh I'm using light flesh from Vallejo. Understanding paint and which paint works together is one of the most powerful pieces of knowledge in this hobby. Because the Vallejo and the Citadel paints are both acrylics, I'm able to mix them together to create different shades of the colour. This is where the wet palette comes into its own. The wet palette means this small amount of paint won't dry out on me and will be available for me to use for at least a day, sometimes even more. Same story now, just the lighter paint and the smaller area of coverage. I'm thinking about where the light would be hitting the shapes and thinking about the raised and uppermost areas and focusing my attention on those. The top of the nose, the tops of the ears and the upper parts of the cheekbones. Then finally, some very small sections were painted with a heavily thinned of the straight light flesh. I was reasonably happy with the flesh tones, so I set about blocking in the hair with a mid-tone brown. Painting the hair starts to frame the face and tends to improve the look of the paint job. It's always an enjoyable step. The second figure received the same treatment as the first, and they were both now ready for some detail painting. The undershirts were usually a light grey colour. A colour from the AK Gen 3 acrylics, grey-blue, was used for this job. This line of paint seems to have a similar consistency to the Citadel paints and brush paints beautifully. Again, by keeping the brush and paint reasonably wet, I'm able to carefully paint the shirt detail using a fine brush. When painting fine details, using different angles with the figure and angles with the brush can make the application a little easier. The belt and the boots are painted in another Gen 3 colour, Grim Brown. The boots were lacking a lot of detail, but I'm planning on posing these guys in long grass, so I didn't waste too much time trying to enhance these parts. These uniforms had a number of significant badges on them, and often a belt buckle. Elements like this can offer a shiny pop to the figure. Matte aluminium from Ammo is a close second to black grey for being one of my favourite paints to use. It's so easy to brush paint and it comes up a treat. A small amount is placed in the wet palette and a fine brush is used to paint the badges and the edges on the shoulder boards. The colours and designs of the shoulder boards had meaning and had colours to match the core they were from. These uniforms generally had a rose pink trim, although that wasn't always the case. But because of the way this figure had been sculpted, I was going to struggle to paint it like that, so I figured the silver trim on the edging would be sufficient to represent the element. Once the silver had dried, a black colour was used to infill the shoulder boards and help define the part. Given the figures I was presenting belonged to a Panzer or Panzer Grenadier division, they would usually have the Totenkopf collar patches on a black background with the rose piping. Trying to paint that detail was a little out of my league, so a small silver dot would have to suffice. I struggled to identify the sculpt on the hat and I painted it in a nondescript way, but I've since found out, or at least suspect, that it's an M43 cap and should look something like this, so I will go back and readdress this at a later date. A mix of red and white to give me a pink rosy colour was then made and a fine outline was applied around the collar markings. Again, keeping the paint wet and limiting the amount of paint on the brush, I'm able to paint some extremely fine lines. It's now the stage where the magic happens, and probably the step most true figure painters will be rolling their eyes. But fact of the matter is, oil paints really do add that extra level of depth to your figure and is the process that unites the previous steps. I'm using burnt sienna and shadow brown at this stage. The paints are from different manufacturers, but that is unimportant, and I'm able to thin them both using an enamel thinner. A small amount is placed in an old bottle top, and a few drops of the enamel thinner are used to thin the paint down into a wash. By carefully letting the thinned oil mix run into the recesses around the details of the figure, I'm able to create depth and contrast in the colours and shapes on the face. Because I'm using an oil over the acrylic, I'm not too worried about making a mess or using too much, because I'm able to wick it away or remove the unwanted application with a clean brush moistened with white spirit. I am, however, careful not to flood the eyes that I've painted previously, because I don't want the dark oils to hide the effect. It should be working together to enhance the look, but the figure that is squinting will really benefit from the dark oil wash, because it will bring out the detail in the sculpt and help show the fact that the character is squinting. The same oil paint technique is now used for the uniform, only this time I'm using black oil paint. The black is focused around the deepest recesses in the uniform and through panel lines and natural shadow lines. The beauty with oil paint is it tends to dry soft, and what I mean by that is once it dries, it should blend in well with the existing paintwork on the figure. Any coverage you aren't happy with can easily be removed with a makeup sponge or a clean brush moistened with white spirit. After about 24 hours, the figures receive an all-over matte varnish using my absolute favourite matte varnish of all time, VMS Matte, and they're ready to go into action. Figure painting is something I really enjoy, but is a part of the hobby I simply don't do enough of. Like with anything, the more we do something, the more we're able to refine our skills and improve our outcomes. There is no painting trick and no golden egg. Improving your figure painting is trial and error and just a matter of getting the runs on the board. One thing I will say though is setting myself up with a wet palette was a game changer, and I'd strongly recommend you give it a try if you haven't already. And pairing that with a basic understanding of oil paints and washes can really elevate your figure game to the next level. I have hundreds of figures in the stash, with each of them being carefully bought with a vehicle or diorama in mind, only to find the inspiration wane as the next new release kit demands my attention. The Hetzer build was the perfect excuse to get some paint on these figures and give me a bit of a change of scenery for the weekend. With these little guys ready to go, it was now time to get back to the Hetzer and give them a vehicle they could be proud to surrender from. If I've added some value today, please hit the like button and subscribe, and comment below if you have anything to add to the conversation. It helps us all grow this community and connect with each other. This is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family, share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I'll see you soon.
An Armour Modeller painting figures with an airbrushing oil washes. Stick in your own lane, buddy.